For most of your life, pruning roses meant one thing in winter. You cut the plant back hard, and you shaped its bones for the year ahead. But the cut you make in the middle of summer is a different animal entirely. In summer, you are not shaping a skeleton. You are having a quiet conversation with the plant's own chemistry. And if you say the wrong thing, the rose listens. Get a summer cut wrong, and you do not just lose a flower or two. You can lose the whole second flush. And on one kind of rose, the kind I will save for the very end, because it is the one almost nobody warns you about, a single careless cut in July can erase next spring's entire show. Not delay it, erase it. So today, the two of us are going to walk through 8 mistakes that quietly sabotage the very blooms you are trying to coax back out. We will count them down, from the one that costs you the least, all the way to the one that can cost you a whole year. And number 8, the one we start with, is a mistake most folks do not even make in summer. They make it in September, and a hard winter does the rest. But before we touch a single mistake, let me hand you the one idea that makes all 8 of them make sense. Because once you see it, you will never look at a faded rose the same way again. Inside every rose, there are 2 messengers always pulling against each other. The first is a growth hormone made right at the tip of each shoot, in the youngest leaves. It flows downward through the cane, and as it travels, it acts like a stern foreman, telling the buds lower down to stay asleep. Gardeners and botanists call that hold over the lower buds apical dominance. As long as the tip is in charge, the rest of the cane simply waits. The second messenger comes up the other way, rising from the root tips, and its whole job is to wake things up, to push out new shoots, new branches, new flowers. So picture it, a steady downward signal saying stay asleep, and a rising signal saying it is time to grow. For most of the season, the tip wins. Now, here is what happens when a bloom fades. That spent flower head keeps sending the downward stay asleep signal while it sets seed, the swollen hip you sometimes see forming where the petals dropped. But the moment you snip that spent bloom off, you remove the source of the signal. The foreman is gone, and those sleeping buds lower down, suddenly free, answer the rising call from the roots and break into fresh, vigorous growth. That is your second flush, and you triggered it with a single, well-placed cut. That is the whole secret. Summer pruning is not about tidying. It is about deciding, on purpose, where the plant sends its energy next. Every mistake we are about to cover is really just a way that quiet conversation gets garbled. And the good news, the thing the bag of fertilizer never mentions, is that none of the fixes cost more than a couple of dollars. Most cost nothing at all but a little attention. One small thing before we begin, and there is a real reason I am asking. The timing on every bit of this shifts with where you garden. So if you would, drop your state, or your growing zone if you know it, in the comments below. When I read back through, it tells me whether you are wrestling with deep south heat that is already brutal, or a cooler northern summer where you have got more room to breathe. It genuinely changes the advice, and I do read them. Let's start the countdown. Mistake number 8 is the one I promised you. The one folks make in late summer and early fall, long after they have stopped thinking about pruning at all. Here is the trap. Deadheading works so beautifully all summer that it is tempting to just keep going. A bloom fades in September. You snip it. You wake those buds up one more time. And the rose, being generous, obliges. It pushes out tender new growth heading into October. But that soft, late growth has no time to harden off before the first frost. And tender growth caught by an early freeze does not just die back quietly, it can open the door to dieback that runs down into wood you wanted to keep, and it leaves the whole plant weaker going into its hardest season. You were trying to give the rose one more gift. You handed it a liability. Mike Hogan, an extension educator with Ohio State University, puts it plainly, for the modern roses most of us grow, the hybrid teas, the grandifloras, the floribundas. His guidance is to stop deadheading those repeat bloomers in late August or September and simply let the last flowers stand. Let them form hips if they like. That is the plant's own signal to start winding down and moving its energy into the roots and the wood, where it belongs before winter. So here is the honest rule of thumb. Count back roughly 4 to 6 weeks from the date your first hard frost usually arrives, and let that be the day you set the deadheading shears down for the year. Your old county extension office, or the Old Farmer's Almanac can tell you that date for your corner of the country. After that, the kindest thing you can do is nothing. Let the rose read the shortening days and prepare itself. The old-timers understood this in their bones. They knew there is a season for coaxing and a season for letting be. A rose put to bed properly in the fall wakes up far stronger in the spring. Sometimes the best pruning cut is the one you decide not to make. Mistake number 7 sounds like good advice, which is exactly why it catches so many careful gardeners. It is the one rule almost everyone has memorized. You have surely heard it. When you deadhead a rose, always cut back to the first leaf that has 5 leaflets on it. And on an established, vigorous bush, something 3 years in the ground or older, with thick, healthy canes, that rule works just fine. By the time a mature plant grows a 5-leaflet leaf, the cane beneath it is usually thick enough to hold up the weight of a new bloom. But here is what the rule never mentions. Apply that same rigid cut to a rose that is young, or weak, or still recovering from the shock of being planted, and you will strip away far too much leaf at exactly the wrong moment. Remember, every leaf is a little solar panel, turning sunlight into the food stored down in the roots. Go hunting for a 5-leaflet leaf on a struggling young plant, and you may end up cutting halfway down the cane, starving the very roots that were trying to get established. And there is a wrinkle the old rule never accounted for. A lot of the newer roses, the ones bred for disease resistance, throw 7 or even 9 leaflets to a leaf. Stand there waiting for a tidy set of 5, and you can walk right past the spot you should have cut, and take off more cane than you ever needed to. So let me give you a fix that takes the guesswork out completely. Forget counting leaflets for a moment, and look at the thickness of the cane where you mean to cut. If it is about as thick as a pencil, or sturdier, it can carry new growth. Go ahead and cut. If it is thinner than a pencil, leave it be, or just snip the spent bloom and an inch of stem below it, and let that young plant keep its leaves and find its feet. On a brand new rose, its first year in your garden, the kindest cut is almost no cut at all. I have watched good gardeners stand over a baby rose for 10 minutes, hunting for the magic 5-leaflet leaf, when the real answer was simply to let it be. The 5-leaflet rule was never a law. It was always just a rough way of asking one question: is this cane strong enough yet? And a pencil answers that question better than counting ever did. Mistake number 6 is the one most people skip right past, because it feels too small to matter, and that is exactly why it costs so many roses. Your pruners are an extension of your own hand, and the kind you use matters more than you would think. There are 2 basic styles. Bypass pruners work like scissors, 2 blades sliding past each other for a clean slice. Anvil pruners crush the stem down against a flat plate. On a living green rose cane, you always want bypass. An anvil pruner crushes the tissue inside the cane, the very plumbing that carries water and food up to your new blooms. And a crushed, ragged wound heals slowly, leaving the door wide open for disease. The same goes for a dull blade. A sharp pruner slices. A dull one tears and bruises, leaving a frayed cut that seals slowly. Here is a quick test you can do at the kitchen table. Try cutting a single sheet of paper. If the blade glides clean through, you are ready. If it crumples and snags the paper, it is time to sharpen or replace it before you touch another cane. But the most important habit on this whole list costs almost nothing, and it lives in a little spray bottle. Imagine you prune a cane carrying a touch of disease. Black spot, say, that common fungus that leaves the dark ringed spots on rose leaves. If you move straight to your next healthy bush without cleaning the blade, you have just become a delivery service for that disease, carrying it from plant to plant across the whole bed in a single afternoon. And there is one disease that makes this truly worth your care. Rose rosette disease is a virus, and there is no cure for it. Once a rose is infected, the only real fix is to dig it out, roots and all. It is carried mainly by a mite, almost too small to see. But those mites can ride along on your shovel and your shears too. Wiping your blade between bushes is not fussing. It is the cheapest insurance you will ever buy against losing a plant you cannot replace. Now, what do you wipe it with? Here is where I will introduce a name you will hear more than once today, because she has spent a career sorting garden folklore from what the evidence actually shows. Dr. Linda Chalker Scott, the urban horticulturist at Washington State University and the author of The Informed Gardener, went through the published research on disinfecting pruning tools. Her honest summary. Several common products work. Rubbing alcohol, dilute bleach, household disinfectants like Lysol. But they are not all equal on your tools. Bleach is the hardest on them. It pits and corrodes steel over time and dulls your good blades. So my practical advice, and hers, leans toward the gentler choice. A $2 bottle of 70% rubbing alcohol from the pharmacy, kept in a little spray bottle clipped right to your tool caddy. A few seconds wiping the blade as you move from one bush to the next, especially around any plant showing spots, yellowing, or odd growth. If you do reach for bleach instead, just rinse and dry the blades well afterward so they do not rust. The key is simply this: keep it close enough that reaching for it never feels like a chore. The moment it is inconvenient, you will skip it, and skipping it once is all it takes. Mistake number 5 moves us to the cut itself, because where and how you cut matters every bit as much as when. And there is a small detail here that quietly shapes your whole bush over a few seasons. Look closely at a cane and you will see small swollen points along it. Bud eyes, where new growth will emerge. And here is the quiet truth. Whichever direction a bud eye faces is the direction the new shoot will grow. Cut just above a bud that points inward, toward the center of the bush, and you are training that rose to grow straight into its own middle. Do that a few times across a summer, and you end up with a tangled, crowded center. Canes crossing and rubbing, sunlight shut out, and almost no air moving through the heart of the plant. That still, humid pocket in the middle is exactly the nursery that powdery mildew and black spot are looking for. You can create a disease problem with nothing but the direction of your cuts. So the habit is simple. Before you squeeze the pruners, look at which way that bud is pointing, and choose one that faces outward, into open air. Then make your cut at a gentle slant, roughly a 45-degree angle, about a 1/4 inch above the bud, sloping away from it. That slope lets rain and dew run off the back of the cut, instead of pooling on the tender bud and rotting it. 2 small errors to sidestep while you are at it. Cut too close, and you nick the bud itself, and it will never sprout. Leave too long a stub above the bud, more than about 1/2 inch, and that extra tissue has no water supply, so it dies back and becomes its own little entry point for rot. A 1/4 inch above an outward-facing bud, sloped away. That is the whole of it. What you are building, cut by cut, is an open, vase-like shape. Strong canes radiating outward, with light reaching every leaf and air moving freely through the middle. And here is the part I love. A rose shaped that way fights its own diseases, through nothing more than sunlight and a breeze. No spray, no bottle. Just a plant set up to breathe. That is about as close to feeding the soil instead of fighting the plant as pruning ever gets. Mistake number 4 is the one I made most often in my own early years. Getting a little too enthusiastic once the shears were in my hand. It is easy to think that more cutting means more control. A tidier, more thorough job. But every green leaf on that bush is a tiny solar panel, quietly turning sunlight into the carbohydrates the plant stores in its roots and spends on new flowers. Strip away too much leaf at once, and you cut off the plant's food supply at the very moment it needs energy most. And the plant does not simply shrug it off. When you take too much leaf in the heat of summer, the rose has to dip into the reserves stored down in its roots, the same reserves it would have spent on blooms, just to grow back enough leaf to survive. So instead of a gorgeous second flush, you get weeks of delay, and then thin, weak, spindly stems. You force the plant to spend its bloom budget on bare survival. So here is a simple guardrail. As a rule of thumb, try not to remove more than about a 1/4 to a 1/3 of the plant's leafy canopy in any one session. And the practical way to honor that, because it is easy to lose track cutting stem by stem, is to work all the way around the whole bush once, lightly, rather than going hard on one side before you move on. That way you can see your running total on the whole plant, instead of discovering you have stripped a 1/3 of it only after you are done. Before you start, stand back far enough to see the whole shape and picture the canopy split into thirds. If your planned cuts, all of them together, would take off more than one of those thirds, put the shears down for today. It is far kinder to come back in a week or two for a second light pass than to shock the whole plant in one afternoon. The rose does not need you to finish in one sitting. It needs enough leaf left to keep feeding itself while it heals. Mistake number 3. As we get a little older, we learn to pace ourselves. We know better than to do heavy work in the worst heat of the afternoon. Well, your roses feel exactly the same way. Every time you cut a cane, the plant loses a little sap and water right at the wound, and it has to seal that wound shut. But how quickly it can do that depends entirely on how much water and energy it has on hand in that moment. Prune during a real heat wave, up above 85 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, or in the middle of a dry spell, and the plant is already in survival mode, with its leaf pores clamped shut to save moisture. It simply does not have the reserves to seal that fresh cut quickly. And an open wound, baking in the summer sun, is an open invitation to cane borers, small insects that seek out fresh cuts to lay their eggs right down in the soft center of the cane. The longer that wound sits open, the more likely something moves in. So we outsmart the heat with a little planning. First, water deeply at the roots a couple of days before you mean to prune. A good long soak, not a surface sprinkle, so the plant has its reserves topped up before you ever make a cut. Second, prune only in the cool of early morning or evening, never in the heat of midday. And if you garden somewhere the heat simply does not let up for weeks, places like Texas, Arizona, the Deep South, inland California, there is no shame in setting the shears down and waiting for a cooler stretch, even if your second flush comes a little later than your neighbors up north. Now, about those borers. Here is an old, frugal trick, and a little honesty about it first. You do not need an expensive wound sealant. But for borers specifically, on a cane thicker than a pencil, you can dab a single drop of plain white glue on the cut surface. The water-resistant kind, like a wood glue or a craft glue-all, not the washable school glue that rinses away in the first rain. Once it dries, it forms a simple cap the borer cannot tunnel through. Pennies a bush, and it takes about as long as wiping your blade. And here is the honest part I promised. That little cap is there to block an insect. It is not a wound dressing to help the cut heal. Because Dr. Chalker Scott, and decades of research before her, found that smearing sealant or pruning paint over cuts to speed healing does the opposite. A plant does not heal a wound the way our skin does. It walls the wound off from the inside. Seal it over, and you mostly trap moisture and invite the very rot you were trying to prevent. So a clean cut, left open to the air, is what actually heals. A dab of glue on a thick cane is only ever about keeping a borer out. Before we get to the last two, and these are the two that matter most, let me give you something to take outside with you. I have gathered everything we have covered onto a single page. The 8 mistakes, the cane thickness rule, the honest timing for letting your roses wind down, and the short list of what actually heals a cut, and what only seems to. It is the kind of page you can tape inside the shed door. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay right here, because mistake number 2 is the one that catches the most careful gardeners off guard. And mistake number 1 is the one that can quietly cost a rose its entire next year. Mistake number 2 happens after you have done everything right. Good timing, clean tools, the perfect angle, and then you simply walk away. Because pruning is not the end of the job. It is the beginning of a demand you have just placed on the plant. Every cut you made told that rose to push new growth, and new growth needs water and food right away. But here is where I want to gently push back on something the garden industry sells awfully hard. The idea that what your rose is hungry for is a big, fast hit of bloom booster from a bottle. A sudden jolt of high-strength fertilizer on a stressed summer plant is more likely to burn tender roots than to feed a flush. The truth the old gardeners knew is quieter than that. A strong second flush does not come from the bag. It comes from roots sitting in living, healthy soil. Soil with enough organic matter to hold water and hand it over slowly. Soil full of the quiet life that feeds a plant at the pace it can actually use. So the move after pruning is not to force-feed the plant. It is to water deeply, all the way down into the root zone, and to feed the ground gently, if at all. A modest, slow, balanced feeding, or a fresh inch of compost, does far more good than a dose of anything that promises miracles. And there is a second piece of this that has nothing to do with feeding, and everything to do with cleaning up after yourself. When you finish, you are left with cut canes, dropped petals, and old leaves lying on the soil right under the bush. Leaving them there is not just untidy, it is genuinely risky. Those fallen leaves, especially any carrying a fleck of black spot, become a quiet reservoir of fungal spores sitting in the dirt. The next time you water, or the next summer rain, droplets hit that infected debris and splash the spores right back up onto the fresh, healthy leaves you just worked so hard to encourage. It is a cycle that reinfects itself, and most folks never connect this season's black spot to the pile of leaves they left under the bush weeks before. So take the extra 5 minutes. Rake or hand-pick every fallen leaf and petal from under the bush. And do not put diseased rose leaves in your home compost pile. Most backyard piles never get hot enough to kill these tough spores, and you will just spread the trouble next year. Bag that debris and send it out with the household trash. Then, with the ground clean, lay down a couple of inches of fresh organic mulch, wood chips or shredded bark, but keep it pulled back a few inches from the woody base, so you are not trapping moisture against the crown. That mulch does 3 quiet jobs at once. It smothers weeds, it keeps the soil cool and evenly moist, and it forms a barrier so any spores left in the dirt cannot splash back up. Water at the roots, feed the ground, mulch, and tidy up, and you turn the most vulnerable moment in your rose's summer into the start of its strongest stretch of growth. And now the one at the very top. Mistake number 1, the single most expensive cut you can make. Because unlike every other mistake on this list, this one cannot be fixed with better technique next time. This one does not cost you a flush. It can cost you an entire year of flowers. Here is the whole trap, in one sentence. Most pruning advice treats every rose as if it were the same plant. It is not. The modern roses most of us grow, the hybrid teas, the floribundas like iceberg, the grandifloras, the tough landscape shrubs like the knockout roses, are bred to be repeat bloomers. They flower on brand new wood that grows this very season. For them, everything we have talked about today is exactly right. Keep them producing fresh wood, and you keep them in flower. But there is a whole other family of roses that lives by a different calendar. The old garden roses, the heirloom albas, the fragrant damasks, the gallicas, the old centifolias and mosses, and many of the once-blooming ramblers handed down for generations. The horticulturists at the University of Illinois Extension are clear about these. The old once-blooming roses flower on old wood, so all of their pruning should wait until right after they bloom. The canes standing on that bush right now, in the middle of summer, are not decoration. They are the literal scaffolding, holding every flower bud you will see next spring. So if you take your shears to one of these in July and cut it back hard, the way you would a floribunda, you are physically cutting off next year's blooms. There is no second chance, no delayed flush. You get a green leafy bush next spring, and not a single flower, because the wood that was going to carry them is simply gone. Climbing roses carry their own version of this trap. A climber grows long, structural canes, the bones that cover your arbor or fence, and shorter side shoots branching off them. And it is those side shoots that carry the flowers. In summer, you only ever shorten the flowering side shoots. Cut into the main structural canes, thinking you are doing routine tidying, and you can remove years of growth you patiently trained into place. How do you know which kind you have? Without a tag or a receipt. Walk out and watch the plant honestly. Has it given you one glorious, deeply fragrant burst of bloom in late spring or early summer, 3 weeks of show, and then gone quiet, setting no new buds since? That is your once bloomer, and the kindest thing you can do is leave the shears in the shed until right after it finishes blooming next year. Is it still pushing out fresh buds and flushes through the summer, even after you have deadheaded it? That is your repeat bloomer, and your normal summer routine is doing just what it should. And when you truly are not sure, an old, thorny, intensely fragrant rose that came with the house, blooming in one spectacular wave each spring, treat it as a once bloomer until it proves otherwise. In summer, take only the dead, the damaged, and the diseased wood, and save any real shaping for late winter, when you can see the plant's whole frame, and you are not gambling with buds you cannot see yet. Many of these old roses were favorites in gardens long before modern roses existed, hardy enough for the coldest corners of the country. Get this one right, and you protect a whole year of flowers with nothing but patience. When we started, I said that a summer cut is really a quiet conversation with the plant, I have come to think that is true of the whole garden, not just the roses. I learned most of this the slow way. For years, I pruned the way the catalogs and the bright bottles told me to, cutting hard, feeding fast, certain that more was better. It took me a long time, and more than a few bare springs, to understand that the rose was never asking for more. It was asking me to pay closer attention, to read the bud before I cut, to leave it enough leaf to feed itself, to let it rest when the season turned. The plant knew what it was doing all along. I was the one who had to learn to listen. None of it took a shed full of chemicals, a sharp pair of bypass pruners, a $2 bottle of alcohol, a dab of glue, a few inches of mulch, and the willingness to walk your roses slowly, coffee in hand, and look underneath the leaves. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, the patient, honest kind your parents or grandparents practiced, back when the county extension man and the almanac were all the help you had, then you already belong here. Subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way, together. Now go on out and look at your roses. They are far more forgiving than the bag ever let on. And with a little of the right attention, they will give you a second act this summer worth waiting for.